Hello, everyone. It's Christine Marie Mason, your host for the Rose Woman podcast. And today I'm going to start just by reading you a poem. It's St. Francis and the Sow, one of my favorites, by Galway Kinnell. And it's on point for today's topic about the inner critic. St. Francis and the Sow. The bud stands for all things, even for those things that don't flower. For everything flowers from within, of self-blessing, though sometimes it is necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness. To put a hand on its brow and retell it in words and in touch, it is lovely until it flowers again from within of self-blessing. As St. Francis put his hand on the creased forehead of the sow and told her in words and in touch, blessings of earth on the sow, and the sow began remembering all down her thick length, from the earthen snout all the way through the fodder and slops to the spiritual curl of the tail, from the hard spininess spiked out from the spine, down through the great broken heart, to the sheer blue milk and dreaminess, spurting and shuddering, from the 14 tits into the 14 mouths sucking and blowing beneath them, the long, perfect loveliness of sow. Blessings of earth on the sow. And the sow began remembering. Blessings, remembering. So I'm really glad you're here. We're going to talk with Neal Allen, who wrote a book called Better Days. It's all about silencing the inner critic and remembering your own loveliness. You're going to learn in this episode how the inner critic is a really helpful adaptation that gets us safely through childhood, but then how it can often overstay its welcome and lead us to live less than optimal lives. So the first 10 minutes or so, Neal talks about his journey, and then we progress, and at the end we even do an exercise where he walks me through letting my inner critic stand down, which you can follow along with. Let's go.
I was living at the time corporate life. I started out in my professional career as a journalist, newspapers and magazines, and then as my family grew and I wanted to make more money, I worked for big public corporations and was happy doing that and was a relatively happy person as far as I could tell. I thought I was about as insecure as anybody else, and I was a complete rationalist, an atheist. I was offended, generally speaking, by religion and religious practices. I did teach Sunday school, but that was for the sake of my kids, not because I believed it. I thought that children deserve to have a sense of an extra layer of protection that church and God and the sincerity that happens in a religious building brings them. And that was all fine until 2006. I was coming out of a terrible marriage, and I was in a room with a therapist, and I said, it's over. I don't feel like I'm in crisis, but I would like to optimize my life. And the next thing I knew, odd things were happening. It turned out the therapist whose room I was in, a guy named Bob Birnbaum, had not only studied with Fritz Perls, the father of Gestalt, and with Carl Rogers, the father of positive psychology, but also had been the head of psychology, as far as I can tell, for a time for the Rajneesh movement, for the Osho community, and had a background that I didn't know about at first in spirituality. And he started to quietly open some doors for me. He introduced me to Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth. And that book just hit me. And here, it had never occurred to me that I was a suffering being. I know that sounds strange. Most people come into spiritual practices through a crisis, or a crisis of faith, or just a general bottoming out in life. And I actually was about, 51 years old or something, and I felt like I had lived a good life and was continuing to live a good life, and I was pretty happy with myself. And Eckhart Tolle told me, no, you're suffering. And I realized, in a very Buddhist sense, and I realized, oh, I am. This is actually something I should look at. And so now I was kind of within a slight bit of kind of neo-Buddhism and a little bit of, this isn't exactly the rationalist world that I had been living in, but it was still pretty close. And the next thing I knew, I was sitting with a friend and with AdyashantiThe. He just retired, but for those who don't know him, he's a modern master, a lapsed Zen practitioner who has his own way. And his purpose on earth, as far as I can tell, is primarily to awaken people like me who had no idea that there was something to awaken, to the possibility of awakening. And that happened to me. I was sitting at a one-day meditation silent retreat in which he talked. It wasn't exactly silent, except for the attendees. And somewhere in the midst of it, a miracle happened to me. And I realized the importance wasn't the nature of the miracle. The importance was that something had happened to me that was not rational, that I knew had actually happened to me. And it didn't matter what it was. And I thought, there's a supernatural world or a world with a different metaphysics than the one that I was operating in that might be deserving of study. And that kind of sent me on my way. So that started me off. And then with Bob Birnbaum, one day a creature just popped up on my shoulder, and it was an objectification of my inner critic, my superego. It was a gremlin, like in the movies. And I started to converse with it. And in the course of the dialogue with it, I discovered that it was protecting my identities. And by then I had been reading a little bit of Buddhism, and I realized, identities, those are things you get rid of. And so I went through a self-determined practice with my gremlin of each week. Instead of doing ordinary therapy with Bob Birnbaum, I would interrogate my gremlin about a different identity. Why do you say I need to be a better father, right? My father identity. Why do I need to look at myself as having a role of father? Those sort of questions. And I did that pretty rigorously, once a week, different identities for about 6 months. And things started to change radically for me. The next thing I knew, Bob and his wife Evelyn, who was a teacher in a mystery school in Berkeley called Diamond Heart, encouraged me into Diamond Heart, and I found that I liked it. And Diamond Heart is a kind of a path to enlightenment school that incorporates various traditions. There's a lot of Sufism and Buddhism, a lot of Gurdjieff thought in it, a kind of synthesis of well-practiced, well-understood ideas and practices. But what it does and did that's a little different than most was that it spends really 5 years mostly on the head center, mostly on the obstacles of the ego. There's meditation also. There's an increasing amount of body work that gets done that accompanies it. But at first, it's really rigorously looking at the obstacles of the ego and moving through them one by one by one. And it worked for me. It made a big difference in how I engaged with the world. And at the end of maybe 5 years of that practice, 2 8-day retreats a year, and then other odds and ends practices related to that, I had enough freedom that my story still ran. I'm still reactive to this day, right, at times, but I don't believe it anymore. And for more than 10 years now, I haven't believed the story as it runs. I don't mind it running. And by the story, I just mean all the ideas that I have about being hurt or being unworthy or unlovable or any of those sorts of things, and tracing them back to stories from my childhood and all of that. I woke up, I mean, there was a day in which I went, wow, I no longer believe my story. And then a little after that, I started finding myself dismantling my life in considered ways and unconscious ways and simplifying my life. And eventually I emerged with a much simpler life in certain respects. In other respects, it's just as busy and complicated as anybody else's, but it was simple enough and is simple enough that I can I can live without a whole lot of strategy and planning and with very few postmortems, if any, at this point. I really don't have much in the way of an ability to go back and say I did something wrong. And then one day I got out of my corporate, somewhere in there I got out of my corporate life and I became an executive coach. And then I shifted out of being an executive coach into being simply a coach because I didn't want to just practice with people who are looking for ways to slightly improve their work life. And I wanted to get at the root of things with people. And so for a number of years, I've been a coach who works with people on moving their inner critic to the side. It's all that I know how to do, and it's what I do with my clients. And all along, my default kind of mastery is as a writer. And so as a writer, I don't actually look for material to write about. It kind of comes my way. And so it's natural that when I was moving through my spiritual adventures that I wrote, I've written a couple of books about my spiritual adventures. The first one called Shapes of Truth, and the second one, the one we're talking about today, called Better Days, Tame Your Inner Critic.
I love that it was in the process of pulling away from your embedded thought process that this little gremlin appeared on your shoulder, and you were really able to identify it as a separate voice from yourself. I mean, there's something in this moment, in both the Ashanti moment and in the gremlin moment, about believing your own experience and believing yourself rather than the externally imposed story that I find really interesting.
Yeah, particularly for somebody who is just an adamant rationalist. It's still kind of stunning to me that there's a way that truth can break through that, even if it looks completely wrong. Even if every idea that I had about truth was upended suddenly, I had no doubt both that the gremlin was there in a metaphoric, imaginary, and real way, and that my experience with Adyashanti, which was just, I might as well mention it, it was that I felt that Adyashanti at the beginning of the meditation with my eyes closed was sucking my soul out of me to investigate it and then returned it back to me. And he was, in my mind, he was going person by person and kind of checking out the room. Now, of course, Adyashanti doesn't do that, right? And of course, my soul wasn't sucked out of me and put back in me. But on the other hand, that's exactly what happened to me. And I knew that. And I wasn't arguing with myself about whether it happened. I realized I could argue with myself about what it meant till the cows went home. But at that point in my life, I knew that didn't matter. All that mattered was there was a possibility to visit other metaphysical conditions than empirical materialism. This is a table and what you see is what you get, which is the familiar world, the only world that I understood myself to have available to me up until that experience and then the gremlin experience, both of them.
Oh, for sure, the light can interrogate people. Like, if someone can look from the light, they can sort of scan you. The trick is that when they scan you, they will see all of the shadow pieces also, but they will see them with unconditional love and non-judgment. So when the light looks, it is one of the most magical experiences because it sees everything, and yet there's total acceptance. The person looking from the light just totally accepts.
Yeah, I always kind of test gurus. Do they exhibit two things that aren't the end-all and be-all, but they're, for me, sure signs that this person might actually know some things. And one is kindness. I expect to see a little bit of kindness or a lot of kindness, a general sense of fascination and generosity, that kind of kindness. And is it possible to offend them? There aren't a lot of people in the world who it's impossible to offend. And I feel very, very fortunate that I've actually met a few of those people and that somewhere along the way, they've lost so much sense of judgment that they're looking not at my shiny surface, but they're looking at my personal essence or my soul or whatever. And by the way, my personal essence or soul is identical to theirs. And they're actually interested in the simplest part of me, the original part of me, the kind of goofy part of me that sits in the center of me and doesn't need to burnish itself or find additional value for itself through external action. Because that's empathy, right? So there's a progression from, we first learned forgiveness, and that's the Jesus learning, right? And forgiveness is basically coming eventually to the understanding that there's no such thing as an enemy, and that forgiveness only works when you forgive everybody because you notice that they're all on defense. Nobody's on offense, right? And then once that's kind of nicely, fully learned, and that's a hard one. So nothing in the culture tells us to do that, because the justice system, the system of politics and social advancement and religion and all these sort of institutional systems have right, wrong, good, bad, right? And so they're ranking people, and so you have to be able to have an enemy or someone to feel superior to or inferior to. And forgiveness teaches you away from that. And then once that's kind of well known, then the next entry is compassion. Compassion is very simple. It's the love that arises in the presence of suffering. And if I'm in or around compassion, that means I'm not uncomfortable within either my own or somebody else's suffering. And once I'm there, I'm pretty damned equal to everybody. And then eventually it opens up. Sounds hierarchical. They're just kind of adjacent to each other. They're not exactly progressive, although most people learn them progressively. But then there's empathy. And empathy simply says, you're me. That all those things that you say about yourself that differentiate you from me are the least important part of you, the most important part of you, the one that I'm interested in and the one that I love being in the presence of, is just like me. And if I had been born in your embryo instead of you, I would have had the same differentiations that you have. And also, I would have been the same me in an undifferentiated way underneath.
I mean, it sounds like it'd be a very critical piece to get to for the inner critic work also, to get to that self-empathy in a way. So I have a question for you. After doing all of this work, have you noticed that there is also an inner counselor that you can trust? And is there an inner critic, but then also the part of you that is deeply wise and knowing that you can trust, that is internalized?
For me, and this is where I get in trouble with the internal family system. I love IFS, and it works, and it's a beautiful, beautiful system, and it's very similar in its intent as what I do. My sense of the inner critic is that it is an externalized parasite that I can move to the side. And the reason I don't need to transform it into a helpful or a benign being is that I already have an authentic self who has, by the time I'm 17, integrated the strategies and the morals and ethics necessary to enter into society as a full adult, as an appropriate adult who knows how to obey the human law, and that whatever set of human laws I've been born into, and that authentic self is far more sophisticated and far more open and interested in what's in front of it than the inner critic, which is always a bully and always judgmental and harsh in a way. And my authentic self has been squeezed out, particularly in certain social situations, confusing situations, or any situation that could be in any way a threat to me. The inner critic takes over and jams itself in and basically squeezes out or drowns out my authentic self. My authentic narrator is by the time I'm 17, is fully developed and fully capable of carrying on my life. And one thing that happens with people is that as they move the inner critic voice to the side, the authentic narrator becomes more confident and loud and more available. I shouldn't say confident. It's always perfectly confident, but more available. And it's interesting because there's a strange modern trope that the head center gets in the way of the body center, and don't pay too much attention to the head center and pay all your attention to the body center because, well, it's true that the head center can be limited in its view, and it can be overrun a little bit by the inner critic. But the fact is, to have an experience, you have to have a head center narration. There is no experience that doesn't end with a readback of the experience. The only time in my life I've had an experience that didn't have a narrator accompanying it, at least at the very end, and I think it accompanies pretty much all the way through, but it's loud always at the very end. I'll just say a really good teacher twice has taken me through a series of thought exercises, taken me to a non-conceptual samadhi, and those are the only two times in my life where there wasn't a narrator. And I knew I had had an experience of a non-conceptual samadhi because the only thing that had happened when I kind of came out of it was the clock had moved, right? There wasn't anything in there. It was like an alcoholic blackout, right? And that's a meaningless experience, right? It's interesting. And it might have some partial meaning as something to explore on the way somewhere or to understand something else. But it lacks meaning. Meaning requires words and a narrator, even if meaning is also accompanied by a different kind of voice in the body or a different kind of language in the body, which of course is present also and can be developed and has a kind of faculty of its own and can replace mental judgment. But that doesn't mean there isn't a narrator there. We love solving puzzles as human beings.
Oh, I was just reading this Osho commentary called Finger Pointing to the Moon. It's on an Upanishad. And in that, he's talking about this thing about samadhi, that basically when you go into samadhi or bliss, it kind of begins with listening and then it progresses. And then you're in this state of which, when you're there, there's really no memory or anything. And then when you come out, it's a reverse process. So you get to the point where you can kind of do a report out or a readout as if you're, trying to explain it to someone. And if you're one of the few people who are generous enough of spirit to be willing to explain it to someone and then skilled enough to be able to write about it or describe it, then the mind is taking over anyway. So even when you're trying to tell people what samadhi is, which is kind of an absence of mind, there's still the part that you have to come back into this realm to describe it. It's a post-mortem interruption of the experiencing mind. Anyway, so in terms of this inner authority of you as a fully developed adult being crowded out by some parasitic voice, which I think you consistently say starts around 6. Is that right?
Yeah. It shows up for two good purposes. So until you're 5 or 6 or 7 years old, whether you're born in the United States or Senegal or India or anywhere in the civilized world, you're in kid world. And even though your parents and other people think that you're learning and you're gaining pattern recognition and a sense of cause and effect, that's actually not happening very much at all. You're learning more or less just the same way a dog does, with association with pleasure or association with lack of pleasure for certain behaviors. But you're not, if you think about it, 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, they don't do postmortems. They don't do a whole lot of regret. They don't do a lot of predictions. They pretty much move in a constant presence from thing to thing to thing. And it's lovely. It's full of curiosity and full of spontaneity and full of innocence, all those sorts of things that we seek as adults later in life when we're meditating and listening to tapes about bringing ourselves back into presence, right? We're really bringing ourselves back into what we already knew at 3 or 4 or 5. And the reason that we're able to do that until we're 5 or 6 years old is there's always either an adult hovering over us, which is almost always what's going on, or we're locked in a room and either way, we can't make a fateful decision of bodily harm. And so we're safe as long as we're under the purview of a nearby adult. And then at 6 or 7, two things happen. One is we go to school not to learn through play, but to learn possibly still some by play, but mostly by rote in first grade. So in first grade, you go from playstations that you get to pick in most kindergartens. You get to pick where to spend your time, at least most of the day. You go to sitting in rows and doing arithmetic for 45 minutes and doing, your first times tables for 45 minutes or reading for 45 minutes. And, putting up your hand to use the bathroom and squirming in your seat until called upon, instead of just going up to the teacher and tugging on him or her to take you to the bathroom. What nobody has told you is, now we're going to teach you the ropes of being an adult. And we're going to take you through it step by step. We start in first grade. And from here on, your job in school is to grow up to learn the rules so that we can launch you into the world and you'll know the rules and you'll be able to fit into society appropriately. That's an important thing to do, but the kid's confused. The kid hasn't developed pattern recognition yet, and cause and effect rules require pattern recognition. And at the same time, oddly enough, simultaneously, the leash is taken off. And a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old, somewhere in there, 5-year-old sometimes, you're allowed 15 minutes outside of the presence of adults, including maybe crossing a busy street, where you could make a fateful decision. And you don't have cause and effect well enough down that you can figure out that you need to look both ways because there could be a hidden car down the street that's coming racing your way. You haven't figured that out. And a little voice shows up and says, I got this for you. And it literally saves your life. Everybody is assisted in crossing busy streets for the first few months or year until that pattern is well instilled in you by a suspicious, slightly angry, and frowning fake parent sitting behind your ear going, excuse me, stop, look both ways, and other rules like that. And it protects you, and it teaches you by negative reinforcement, because these are fateful decisions and you could get creamed and so you can't use a whole lot of gentle, kind NVC kind of behavior in order to impress on a kid that these are decisions you can't mess around with. So everywhere you're allowed to have, I don't care how gentle the culture is, you're allowed to have an angry, scornful, frowning parent accompany you around your life starting when you're 6. People say, how can I work with my children so that they don't have to suffer this? And I'm like, why would you want that? You want this voice around a kid who's 6, 7, 8 years old. And you also want the kid to learn quickly a bunch of the rules and get them reinforced, not just the safety rules, but also the burgeoning, how to get along with people rules. And you got a voice that's helping the kid store things into memory. It's helping the kid reinforce things. It's helping the kid develop pattern recognition. And if that's all it did, and if it eased off and started to disappear at around 12 years old, nobody would care. The problem is it sticks around. And then it gets to like its job. And by the time you're 17, you've learned all the rules that it knows because it's kind of dumb, right? It's not you. It's not a real human being. And so I can call it a moron. right? I'm not insulting it because it's not real. It's a facsimile of a human being. It's got a range of emotions that goes from anger to snarky and nothing beyond that. It's a bully. It treats you like you're always a 6-year-old, and you're not. And at 17, what I tell parents is, at 17, give your kid a diploma that says you've graduated from the inner critic, and you might want to do a little bit of work to get it removed from your head now.
There's a piece in what you're saying here that's very similar to all sorts of trauma healing, where you sort of thank your adaptation for being so intelligent. Like, hey, you were really useful. I needed you not to get run over. But then when it's no longer useful, you have to consciously release it. But then this inner critic, seems to have a pretty strong grip. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing in clinical practice or with your clients. Where does the inner critic really take hold? And what is the process that they're going through to sort of tame that voice or remove that parasite, get it extracted so they can return to their core intelligence and authentic self?
Fortunately, every inner critic is like every other inner critic. And so over the course of working on the inner critic with clients, I'm not saying these are the only ways to deal with it, but these are ways that are tried and true, right? And I can meet a new client and I can predict how their inner critic will answer certain questions and what their inner critic will respond to. And there are two things that I point out to my clients are most important. The first is meet your inner critic and pull it out from its subvocal, hidden kind of vampire existence and force it into the open. And the more you can force it into the open and listen to the exact words that it is saying, the more you are going to recognize that you don't need it because you're smarter than it, you're more objective than it, and you're not a 6-year-old anymore. You don't need to be bullied like you're a 6-year-old. And the second thing that I tell people is I only offer one possible piece of homework. And it's the same for everybody. It's the same for me. It's the same for all of my clients. It's when you catch your inner critic belittling you, stop if you can and kind of mentally point up to where you're hearing it from and say, oh, that's you. And each time you do that, simply saying, oh, that's you, to the inner critic, you're reminding yourself that you just paid attention to the words it was saying. And by paying attention to the words that it's saying, you notice it's repetitive, dumb, not telling you anything you didn't know, a bully, and overall, not necessary. But you don't even have to think all of those things because they all appear more or less to you when you say, oh, that's you. If you can say, oh, that's you, most people can do it once or twice a week at first. But if you can get up to 10 times a day, there's a good chance, I don't monitor this, so I don't know in percentages what this is like, but there's a good chance that within a few months you're going to have a substantial reduction in anxiety. So the inner critic is the root of all anxiety. Freud got this piece exactly spot on when he said that anxiety is the fear of the punishment of the superego, which means that anxiety isn't over the concrete consequence of a choice, the worry that you're going to get a particular thing wrong. Anxiety is actually only the worry that an absent parent, an imaginary absent parent, will frown at you if you get it wrong. And knowing that, you can see why pointing to it and recognizing it as a frowning absent parent saying a stupid thing to you over and over again might reduce your anxiety. All I've ever been scared of is a frown from an absent parent who's a generic parent. Isn't really my parent. It's just a useful generic parent, disappointed, or the nagging mom. Boy, there's a trope that adds misogyny to our culture, right?
Oh, I read that post, by the way. If you guys have a chance to go over and read this post on Neal's website, he talks about subtle misogyny and this 1% misogyny that is still in our bodies, a living memory of being a small child and being sort of nagged on by your mom or something like that, that is carried into adulthood, not as as an outgrown adaptation. Anyway, it's a good post. It's very honest.
Yeah, so about 80% of my clients hear their inner critic with the inflections of their mother. And it makes sense because this is all about the inner critic is all about the basic rules, right? Be honest, right? Don't screw it up. Don't hit your brother, right? And so those kind of messages generally are more repetitively brought to us by our female caretaker, because generally speaking, traditionally and in action, even to this day, the female caretaker, the mother or grandmother or mother substitute, spends more time during the day with the small children with the 6-year-old learning the rules. And so it's handy for that voice to be replicated in this facsimile of an authority that you carry around with you. And if 80% of people are hearing their inner critic as a nagging mom, then there's trouble afoot for women in general.
I noticed in my own relationships that sometimes I'm just being met as if I am a nagging mom. I mean, some of them definitely think of me like a nagging, annoying mom figure, and there's a lot of transference. Or my partner will be like, have a reaction to something that I don't understand where it's coming from, and then I realized how it's tapping into this latent feeling of, am I displeasing my mom kind of energy? And I know it's kind of sad, actually, to be our age and still have that projection.
Yeah.
Anyway, you have a lot of practical tools in the book for how to tame the inner critic and exercises and stories. So do we want to do a little bit like an example of how you might work with that?
Let's do the central exercise. If it can make decent radio podcasts sometimes, and so I'll do it with you. And I'm going to ask you to poll and people can follow along. So first, let me ask you, what sorts of things does your inner critic say to you?
It says you should work harder. You should be more careful in all of the details of the work and do it better. It says all that.
Yeah, do it better. That's a big one.
It says you're not as advanced as you should be at this point with all of the resources you've had in your life.
Yeah, you should rank higher.
It says you were great once, and if you had only kept up with that and not gone soft, you'd be great now, but you're a big sloth.
Yeah, there you go. Those are good. Where in your physical geography do you hear the voice coming from?
It's kind of right behind the right ear, kind of, but then there's a quick follow on to like activation in the belly. Like even saying those things that I just said out loud makes me sleepy, made me slightly nauseous.
Yeah, most people hear it in their head, behind their eyes somewhere, behind their ears. Some people hear it in their solar plexus or their belly, but if it's in the solar plexus or belly, it's toward the front of it. It's always toward the surface because it's mediating your relationship with the outside world. So your authentic voice you can find much deeper inside you if you look for it. In fact, it doesn't even have to rise to the ears. It just kind of can emanate in a subtle and a deep way, deep in your body. I mean, I want you to. Oh, and when you hear your inner critic's voice, whose inflections does it have?
It's kind of like my grandmother or my dad. I can't really tell. They're sort of merged into one person here.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a good point, which is even if it sounds distinctly like a single person, it's carrying all the authoritarian lessons that a child needs, the ones that one parent delivers, the ones that the other parent delivers, the ones that the teacher delivers, the older sibling delivers, the other caretaker delivers, whatever. It's just an empty vessel acting like a single human being, but it's actually a combination of all the authoritarian voices that are necessary for you to be able to survive 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old. I want you to, and this is the funny part, right? Trippy part. I want you to pull it out from behind your head and stiff arm one arm in front of you and face the palm to you so that you're looking past your arm at your palm, and it'll appear there. And tell me when you see a face in your palm. Okay? And what's its expression? And by the way, if you don't see a face right away, don't worry about it. Just follow along as if you're seeing the face. But keep your arms stretched out there if you're following along with us. And keep your palm facing you and keep looking at where the face would be if it's not there, or the face. What's the expression on the face?
It's that sort of beady eyes and drawn into its head, and then it has a little smirk that is like one side upturned, and the other side sort of irritated and disappointed.
That's very typical. They look scornful or sometimes angry or suspicious. They don't look friendly. They don't look loving. They don't look peaceful. Right? So I'm going to feed you a series of questions. Ask it aloud, the question, so I can hear it too. It will answer and say in its words its answer back to you. First question is, when did you take charge?
When did you take charge? It says 7.
Who put you in charge?
Who put you in charge? Well, it says you did.
Yeah. Why are you still in charge?
Why are you still in charge?
I'd like to take charge for a while. Is that okay?
I'd like to take charge for a while. Is that okay?
I need a yes or no. Is that okay?
I need a yes or no. Is that okay?
Okay. Are you worried something bad will happen to me if I take charge?
Are you worried something bad will happen to me if I take charge? It has like a "you're too wild" sort of response.
Okay. How do you know I can't tame myself?
How do you know I can't take care of myself? Well, now it's just laughing at me. No. It says it doesn't know.
Okay. I think I can tame myself. Are you worried something bad will happen to you if I take charge?
Are you worried something bad will happen to you if I take charge? Oh, from that I get really, really quiet, like sort of a stone face, like it almost went dead.
Okay, I'm going to ask you again. I need a yes or no. Are you worried something bad will happen to you if I take charge?
Are you worried something bad will happen to you if I take charge? No.
Okay. Are you worried you won't exist if I take charge?
Are you worried you won't exist if I take charge? Yes.
I promise I won't annihilate you.
I promise I won't annihilate you.
Isn't it tiring running the show all the time?
Isn't it tiring running the show all the time?
Did it answer? I didn't get the answer.
Yes, it answered yes. And then this big sort of détente, and my body kind of really dropped in and relaxed at the same time.
Yeah. Ah, nice. How would you like to go into semi-retirement as my occasional ethical advisor?
How would you like to go into semi-retirement as an occasional ethical advisor? Deal.
This is important to me. It won't be easy for you, and I don't expect you to be perfect at it.
This is important for me. It won't be easy for you, and I don't expect you to be perfect at it.
But if you succeed at this, you will have fulfilled your charter, which was to turn me from a kid into an adult.
But if you succeed at this, you'll have fulfilled your charter, which was turning me from a kid into an adult.
And what's its expression when you say that?
Calm, and the eyes are open. It's really interesting. Like there were 2 little beady eyes in the beginning, and now the eyes are wide open and open, looking straight at me. The mouth is turned up on both sides. Yeah, sweet.
I'd like to thank you for saving my life when I was a little kid.
I'd like to thank you for saving my life when I was a little kid.
And then put it back into your head. So what was that like?
Well, it's a very strange visual experience, first of all, because there really was a face there in the hand, and the face is changing expressions, and it rolled its eyes, and occasionally its eyes were open, and that went from scorning to a smile. It's a very strange visual experience.
It is. The weirdest part of it, the trippiest part is that they all answer the questions about the same way. I mean, you can see some certain variations, but eventually they come to, or you come to the same conclusion, which is they're a little more interested in their own survival than in bettering you by this time.
Do you wait for that? You know, I love this, like, lifelong growth. I also want to say we do a lot, and because the men and women who listen to the show tend to be midlife, we do a lot of work on finding yourself in midlife and awakening to new possibilities at that time. So the story of your grace coming to you, this whole new world opening up at 51 is also timely for this community. And even for me, just doing this exercise, like, we have to be committed to lifelong learning from the day we're born until the day we say goodbye to this plane. There's always something more that we can discover. And I really appreciated doing that exercise for you, just to see how much that little voice still lives inside, and then it's possible to release it. So tell me a little bit about what you're up to. I know you're hosting some workshops and you've got the book. How would you like people to interact with you and find you?
Yeah, you can find me and find my workshops and appearances at shapesoftruth.com. I'm on Instagram and Facebook every once in a while also.
The book is Better Days, and I have a feeling that if you do these practices, you will indeed find better days. And I'm also so encouraged by just this overall lifestyle that you've created for yourself. And I want to end on this note. What would it be like to live a life with very little strategy and very little postmortem, very little analysis? Like what Ram Dass talks about as be here now is a kind of a way to describe it, which is to be fully in the moment and trusting life as you encounter it. Just think what a lovely message that you're bringing.
Oh, thank you. And what people often forget is that just because I am removing strategy or much sense of future doesn't mean I've lost any of my practical knowledge. And it doesn't mean that the world isn't going to put me into a productive path. I just don't have to spend much time guiding that path.
Yeah, I work harder now, but it doesn't really feel stressful.
Yeah.
Love speaking with you so much. We're going to do a giveaway on the book, as we always do. We always buy a copy and then do a giveaway to people who comment on the show. So if you're a Spotify-based listener, they've added a feature now where you can ask questions within Spotify. So please do that and either comment there or on Instagram at the.rose.woman, and you'll be entered to win this beautiful book, Better Days. Silencing the Inner Critic is a very worthy endeavor. Thank you so much, Neal, for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Christine.